The Turkish Reconquista, Turkey's forgotten refugee crisis. One topic I briefly mentioned in another video, which I definitely wanted to expand on, is the refugee crisis created during and after the Ottoman-Russian War of 1878, where the Russians aimed to conquer Constantinople, where certain Osman Pasha gained enough time for Western powers to intervene, and where the modern Balkan states were born out of. And before we start, this is going to be a long and commentary-like video. It is impossible to explain everything in detail, and this video should serve as an introduction to the topic. If you're interested in the topic, I recommend reading these two books. Anyway, if you're familiar with modern nationalism on the Balkan or the Caucasus or the Middle East, you will know that they are usually based around how the evil Ottomans of evilness were evil for the pure sake of being evil for centuries, and where the enlightened goodish people of divine goodness rescued themselves. But the more important aspect is the victim mentality these nations build their ideology and nationalism on. From my Armenian Genocide Deportation series, you will already know that there were millions of Muslim victims, which never manifested itself into a Turkish form of victim mentality. However, since this is a video based on certain books, it raises the question, why are the books like The Balkan Reconquista only published in recent years and not decades earlier? To begin this topic, we first have to understand that communism and whether the Iron Curtain were not just some ideological clashes, but physical barriers, where historians were not able to visit each other's archives. As a result, many objective research could only be done after the fall of communism, if not decades later. Which raises the question, why? Why decades later and not after the fall of communism? This is so often a huge topic of its own, but long story short, Orthodox nationalism was largely influenced by the Russian Empire, which was anything but objective towards Muslim Turks. Terms like "you Mongoloid, go back to Mongolia" is propaganda that was created by the Russian Empire centuries earlier, and this kind of nonsense is still used up to this day. In case of Bulgaria, being a Muslim or a Muslim Turk was synonym of being anti-Bulgarian, which is why Turks were systematically oppressed and driven out of the country by the state itself. Things might be different today, but the once prosperous Muslim population in Bulgaria vanished to below 10%. Obviously, Bulgaria and with it Bulgars need time to order their newly found independence and ideology, and obviously this is not going to happen overnight. However, to give you an idea of how things were, in the 80s, under the dictator Todor Zivkov, Bulgaria, in a bid to create a homogeneous country in line with its communist ideals, launched a campaign to end all distinctive ethnic features of the community, from giving new Bulgarian names to Turks to banning their century-old customs, and worst of all for many, banning speaking Turkish in public. This process of revival, as described by the regime, continued with the closure of mosques. The Turkish community had little means of resistance, except sporadic protests. This should give you a glimpse of what was actually going on in Bulgaria alone, and this kind of sentiment continued throughout the Balkan. But that's a topic for another time. And no, I don't think Turkey was much better in the past. Turkey has its own fair share of dark history. The point here is that there is a clear anti-Turkish bias by Balkan nationalists about how the Ottoman Empire was, and granted, I'm sure there is also somewhat of a bias on the Turkish side, but by no means to the degree that the Turkish people would antagonize Bulgars or Serbs or Greeks in general. This bias was also noticed by William H. Old, the author of mentioned book, to which he says, "Much of the scholarship is classified as being pro-Turk or anti-Turk. However, it has become clear to me that the label pro-Turk is not intended as a euphemism in an academic content, rather it is meant as a warning label. Works deemed to be pro-Turk should be, for some reason, studied with a massive doses of suspicion." And while I believe that any pro-Turkish source should be taken with a grain of salt, this is not equal to taking only pro-Turkish sources with a grain of salt. As the author indicates, all pro-something sources should be taken with a grain of salt. The European sources included, to which the author notes, European ethnological studies also cannot be considered a reliable source because they were often based on erroneous data, bias, or plain imagination. Non-Ottoman stories are often plainly tendencies, various European, Russian, and the Balkan demographic studies sought to produce numbers to benefit their respective political agendas. The Russians, for example, presented demographic numbers for Bulgaria at the Istanbul conference that were widely inaccurate. Europeans at the time preferred to subsume all the ethnic Turks as well as other Muslims under an indistinct category of Turks. But they did not refer to Galgos Turks, a group of ethnic Turks who had migrated from Anatolia in the 13th century and adopted Orthodox Christianity, as Turks. In short, Christian Turk is a good Turk and not a Turk at all. Muslims are all Turks and not good human beings. This might sound harsh and exaggerated, but you will understand later in the video why this view is important and not an overstatement of how things were. All of this being said, let's get started with the topic, headline by headline. What was Bulgaria to Turks? Well, first things first, Bulgars are as native to the region of the Balkan as Turks. They conquered their way in at roughly the 7th century, so acting like Bulgars are native and Turks foreign to the Balkan is really nothing else than a dick measuring competition. This being said, contrary to common misconception, Bulgaria was not foreign territory to the Ottomans, but the heartland of the Ottomans, economically, culturally, and politically. It created more revenue than the entity of Anatolia combined, and it saw more progress than the rest of the Ottoman Empire in terms of liberal rights. If you want to learn more about it, I recommend reading the book, since I don't have the time to explain it here in detail. Rightfully or not, Bulgaria was seen as part of Turkey not only by Turkish nationalists, but also European writers and travelers. Bram Stoker described Bulgaria, for example, as Turkeyland in his fictional book Dracula. And while you may bring the argument that fictional work is fictional, it does tell us a lot about the perception of people at that time. To add more meat to this thesis, in 1877, Russian Imperial Commissar Alexander Mikhailovich Dondukov-Korsakov described Sofia as a forest of minarets. Bulgaria at the time had over 2,300 mosques, Sofia alone had 45. So this perception was not just imagination, but you could literally see through the architecture visually and culturally that Turkey started at the Danube. What was once described as the forest of minarets is not even remotely visible today. And before people jumped into the comment section, be it right or wrong, a gigantic part of history was forever destroyed. Whether the Ottomans were good or evil does not change the fact that culture was destroyed, and people that lived for centuries in an area were expelled. And before people jump to the comments to claim that the Ottomans of evilness just tried to convert everyone, which is why it is justified, well, first things first, everyone did that, Bulgaria itself included, so it's kind of weird to make an argument out of this in case of the Ottoman Turks and ignore it in every other case. Secondly, contrary to common misconception, this was not the case. The author notes, there was quite a variety of religious views, however, the Sufis were known to be less strict about the duties and prohibitions of official Islam. For example, Friday prayers, the veiling of women, and the proscription against alcohol were not as rigorously observed. The strong Sufi presence meant that folk Islam was commonplace in Rumelia and pluralism reigned. No major Islamic learning centers were ever developed in the Balkans, which remained free of doctrinal strife. Now you might say, but it doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of people were Bulgars. Well, this heavily depends on what time frame you're looking at. Towards the mid to end of the 19th century, more and more Muslims migrated to Rumeli, aka Bulgaria, and by the time the Ottoman-Russian War started, roughly half of the population was Muslim. Other way to summarize this part with a quote and to explain the loss of Rumeli, aka Bulgaria, to Turks, I would like to quote a poem which makes it clear what I lack in words to explain. The Danube is our water of life. If the Danube were to go away, our homeland could not survive. Whether you dig along the Danube's bank, you will find the bones of your father or your brother. The rising silt that makes the Danube's water murky is the very substance of our defenders' bodies. Namık Kemal, Vatan Yahut Celeste. Yet, does all of this mean that everything was fancy, stable, and peaceful? Ethnic and religious tensions. Let's start the topic by the constitution first. Because the ethnic tensions are a huge mess, as it is always the case when it comes to the Balkan. Christians had to pay an extra tax and had to accept Muslim rulership, but they got autonomy, security, and were free of any military service, with certain exceptions, but generally speaking, they did not participate in a war. People were divided into a millet system. All Muslims were grouped as one millet, while all Christians and Jews had their own. This means an Orthodox Turk that was part of the Greek Church was considered Greek. There was extreme social mobility as long as you were a Muslim. You could even become the second most powerful person in the empire. This was quite unheard of for most, if not the entity of the world. The respective heads of the church were basically governing their millet, not the Ottoman authority. Except for some petty persecution, they left the patriarchy largely to its own devices. Non-Muslims were not allowed to construct houses near mosques. They were required to dismount in the presence of Muslims, were not allowed to carry arms, church bells were forbidden. There was a prohibition against wearing green for non-Muslims. However, due to the autonomous and decentralized rule of the Ottomans, these laws were often ignored or simply not enforced, or were quite flexible and ever-changing in their application. All of this changed later on during the 19th century with the Tanzimat era. The Jews had their own special rule. Among all the other groups, they were not pressured at all to convert to Islam. In fact, the ones that were forcefully converted were allowed to reconvert back to their religion. As a result, Jews were quite interested in the well-being of the Ottoman Empire. The millet system can be summarized by 3 words: separate, unequal, and protected. To what extent you can or can't blame the Ottomans for this, I will leave everyone to judge this on their own. The Ottoman society was highly polarized, complex, and unique. Even the Tanzimat era, which was a genuine attempt to make it right for everyone, caused tensions from and towards everyone. The Ottoman millet system was what created the relative stability upon which the Ottoman Empire could rely and expand its territory on. But it is this very system which, thanks to nationalism, created a weapon for the very doom of the Ottoman Empire. The truth is, for the Ottoman Empire there was never a solution to make everyone happy in the first place. In the following part, I want to mention some points which I don't really see fitting as a topic of its own, but it's also important enough for me to include it. So the following will be a number of statements for various topics. The word Balkan is actually of Turkish origin and means rather benignly mountain or wooded mountains. Some are asking what the legacy of the Ottomans are for the Balkan, while not realizing that the Balkan itself is the Ottoman legacy. Ironically enough, the Turkish tribesmen were used as mercenaries by the Byzantine army against the Bulgars. And ironically enough, it was the Byzantine Emperor John Cantacuzenius who aided the Ottomans on their European front in 1345 by dispatching the Byzantine navy to transport the Ottomans to the European side. So it is thanks to the Greeks why the Ottomans even entered Europe. There was obviously also a war of propaganda going on during the 19th century, and to combat the Russian propaganda, Mithat Pasha created a bilingual Turkish-Bulgarian newspaper that published from 1865 up until the Ottoman-Russian War. What makes this topic a joke of destiny is the fact that the Balkan nations went to war armed to their teeth by ruining their economies in order to exchange one overlord with another. The Ottoman authorities were replaced by German kings that would lead the newly formed Balkan nations, and ironically enough, the path of these new kings would be war and destruction. The Balkan was a prosperous region, be it the pig monopoly of the Serbs on the Balkan, the agricultural exports of Romania, the industry in Rumeli, or the port of Saloniki in Greece. All of that vanished in years. Lastly, this is a part I would like to quote from the book, since no amount of description from my side will explain it better than the way the author did. During the Ottoman-Russian War in 1877-78, an initial shock for the Russians, perhaps greater than the weakness of the Turkish defenses, was the discovery that average Bulgarian peasants possessed higher standards of living than their Russian counterparts. One Russian called it a prosperity from which Russian peasants are as far away as from the stars in heaven. Another Russian officer said, God help know for certain that in the next 100 years we shall not have it. There was no reason to liberate the Bulgarian. They are better off here than the ruling Turks. Misgivings developed as many Russian officers were quickly disenchanted with the ungrateful, uncouth Bulgarians that they thought they were there to save. In the last part I would like to get into the horrors of the Russian-Ottoman War. Now this part I don't want to get into detail because I don't think YouTube is a platform to discuss these things. However, the atrocities done were along the lines of raping thousands of Muslim women in the forest and then killing them in front of their children. It goes along the lines of collecting weapons from Muslim villages under the promise of protecting them, just to give these weapons to neighboring Orthodox villages in order for them to massacre entire Muslim villages. It goes along the line of blowing mosques up during a storm and blaming it on the lightning. It goes along the lines of chasing hundreds of thousands of Muslims out of their homes and creating a refugee crisis in Istanbul, where even the Sultan opened his palace in order to take care of Muslim refugees. The aim of the Bulgar revolutionaries was not just the liberation of their people, but the extermination of all Muslims from Europe. It was not based on caring for the Bulgar peasantry, but fulfilling fascist sentiments. These war crimes were not just reported and noted by people at that time or William H. Old himself, but also by an international commission consisting of French, British, American, German, Austrian, and Russian experts. So this isn't fiction, but rather a well-documented part of history, which is often overlooked. And no, I don't expect an apology from Bulgars or any other Balkan people. I don't think they have to feel guilty about anything either. This happened in the past and atrocities happened on all sides. Rather than blaming only one side, today's people, Balkanians and Turks, should think about how to get along in order to make the region matter again. To make it work, not only for the sake of their own people, but for the sake of the entire region. This part of dark history should not be an argument in order to slander all of Bulgar history, but at the same time, Bulgarians should understand that, for instance, the Batak massacre is not an argument to slander 600 years of Ottoman rulership. Was the Ottoman constitution unfair compared to today's standards? Absolutely, but for its time it was one of the most tolerant ones. Did Ottoman rulership include massacres and oppressions? Yes, but it also included stability, prosperity, and peace for most of its rulership. The Ottoman history is a complex and dynamic topic, and simplifying it with a tribal mentality as in us versus them is not doing justice to this topic. But at the same time, each side has to acknowledge that both sides have a fair share of responsibility for the massacres that happened and that they did happen. All of this revolutionary gibberish was not for the sake of divine liberation, neither was the Ottoman response for the sake of divine protection. At the end of the day, innocent people had to suffer because a tiny minority was hell-bent on war. I quoted this in another video, and I will quote it again. One day, not 100 yards from a train, and in view of all, a woman took her 2 children, about 5 and 3 years old, and plunged a dagger into each of their hearts. In interrogation she stated she had done so to prevent the possibility of them experiencing the misery she had already gone through, the wretchedness she was now enduring, and that still loomed in the distance. This does not have to be, and is under no circumstances, justifiable.